Patchy rain continuing in the northeast, but drier for the northwest and a low of 4 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Ben Kentish.
It's just gone 11 o'clock. Ben Kentish here with you on LBC. Very good evening if you're just joining us here on the programme. Want to talk to you for the next hour about a massive crisis in this country. And it really is. You might laugh at me for saying that, but it really is a massive crisis. And that is the fact that far fewer people than in years gone by are having children. Far fewer people in this country are having children. I mean, why on earth is that a crisis? Who cares about that? It's people's individual decisions. If more and more just don't want kids, that's fine. That's freedom. That's progress. Well, yes, nobody's saying people should literally be forced to have children, because clearly that gets you to a pretty frightening place. But it is a worry, and it is a crisis, because for the first time in 50 years in this country, according to data out today, more people are dying in Britain than being born. Now, again, you say, so what? Population shrinks, resources are freed up, there's less pressure on public services, great. OK, on the face of it, fine, good thing. What that avoids, of course, is the fact that it's not just that people are dying in greater numbers and being born in lower numbers, it's that we've got an ageing population. And we need workers. We need young people. We need them being the doctors and the teachers and the police officers and the business owners and the cleaners and the security guards and the waitresses and I could go on and on. We need them doing those jobs, partly because the jobs need doing and the alternative is just having higher and higher immigration, but also, of course, because we need them paying taxes. We need them keeping the economy going. We need them funding the NHS and the welfare state. And we have a crisis coming. It might not be a crisis now, but it's going to be a crisis very, very quickly. Because if fewer and fewer people are being born now, fast forward 20 years when those people are supposed to be filling those jobs, and quite simply, they aren't there. So the issue of why fewer people are having children now, why for the first time deaths have outstripped births, is a massive one. A really, really fundamental one for the future of this country. It's not just us, it's happening across the Western world, and that might feed into your views on what's going on, because if you want to call and say, oh, it's the Tories or it's this, that or the other, you've also got to explain why it's not happening, why it's also happening in other countries. But that's the issue I want to get your thoughts on. Why do we have, to put it in a scientific term, a declining birth rate? To put it more simply, why are fewer people having children at all? And why are those that are choosing to have kids having fewer of them, not having as many children as in generations gone past? The average number of children per woman in this country before the age of 30 is now below 1. So the average 30-year-old woman won't have a single child. In the 1970s, it was much closer to 2. So you see in our less than half a century, something really fundamental has changed. And there's all sorts of explanations for this. It's about fertility, it's about cost, it's about people prioritizing careers, it's about, I hear young people tell me they don't want kids because they're scared of climate change and they don't want to bring them into this world. There's all sorts of reasons. If you've made that decision, whether it was not to have children at all or whether it was not to have as many as perhaps you once thought you would, perhaps you were going to have 4, you've got 3, perhaps you were going to have 2, you've got 1. How much of it was enforced? How much of it was simply saying we haven't got the space or we haven't got the money? And how much of it was choice? Why do you think, whether this is you or somebody you know, you've just got a view on it, why do you think people in this country aren't having children in the numbers that only a couple of decades ago we were? You know the number, 0345 6060 973. Call me or WhatsApp me on that number. Text me if you like, 84850. You can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. Let's talk first tonight on this to Miriam Cates, former Conservative MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge, who during her time in Parliament was one of the sort of leading voices, I think, trying to alert us to the issue and the problem that this is posing. Miriam, very good evening to you.
Good evening, Ben.
Great to have you back on the programme. I know you and I have spoken before. Just remind us, if you would, why this is such a such a big problem. I sort of touched on it there, but put it in your own words. Why should people care about this?
Well, for a number of reasons. I think one reason is that young women say that they do want children. On our average, women want 2.2 children. So there's a lot of women out there, millions and millions of women, in fact, who will never become mothers, even though they want to be, or will have fewer children than they ideally said they would like. And that is obviously a source of huge grief to people, men as well as women, not having children when they desperately wanted to do. So that's a big social problem. But then there's also a huge economic problem, because in order to pay for pensioners, essentially, so pensions and healthcare, which is well over half of our welfare state now, we need people to pay tax. And that means young people of working age. And in the 1970s, there were 4 people of working age for every pensioner in this country. Now there's 3 people of working age for every pensioner. And by the end of my life, there'll be 2 to 1. So if you just think about the pressures that puts on working age people in terms of how much tax they will have to pay to support pensioners, I mean, it is completely unaffordable. And I think economists realise now that our pension system, our healthcare system is now completely unaffordable because we just don't have enough young people coming into the workplace. And actually, the figures on that now are stark. We have 30% fewer babies born each year than we will need to support the population. So that's a massive gap. And actually, what we're heading for is poverty, stagnation, massive inflation, huge labour market shortages. And you just got to look at somewhere like Japan, which has got very low birth rates and no immigration. They've got a 250% debt to GDP ratio. Old people die alone, undiscovered for weeks because there just aren't enough people to care for them. So it's a pretty horrible future if we don't increase the birth rate.
How much of it, in your view, in terms of why people aren't having children, how much of it is choice and how much of it is just enforced necessity? They don't feel that they can.
Well, I think it's a bit of both. As I said, the vast majority of young people do want children, and they want 2.2 children. So if everybody got what they wanted, we wouldn't have a birth rate issue. So I think, in theory, people do want children, but there are lots of reasons why they don't. I think the most practical problem that we've got is people leaving it too late. So I think a lot of people don't realise just how quickly female fertility does decline in the 30s. So, for example, if you wanted to have 3 children, if you want a high chance of having 3 children, you probably need to start trying for your first baby by 25. Now, that's very young by today's standard. And what often happens is people wait till their mid-30s, they do manage to have a child, but they can't have a second one. Whereas actually, if they'd started earlier, they might have had 2 or 3.
But the flip side of that is more women having careers, more women sort of having a life before they become mums and so on, more women juggling child motherhood and career and so on. I mean, it's not, there's trade-offs.
That is part of it, absolutely. And there does, of course, things like cost of housing, student debt does make a difference. That's absolutely true. But as you said in your introduction, this is a phenomenon across the world, not just in the West now, but actually in developing countries as well, which is extraordinary because in the past, lower fertility has always been linked with industrialization, with wealth. But now you've got even countries like India, whose birth rate is well below replacement. So it's something more than just the economics. What's really interesting is the only Western country where this isn't happening is Israel. Israel has a birth rate of over 3 children per woman, and that's across all, social classes in Israel. It's the in thing to have kids. Israel has a very pro-natal culture for obvious reasons. They want to replace their population, and that's what we just don't have in other countries in the West. And I think there's so many factors. We could talk about this for hours. I think social media's had a big impact. Certainly after the 2010s, birth rates have collapsed even more. And I think just being, an anti-child, anti-parent society is how I would describe it. And lots of people have said to me, it's such a selfish thing to have children. And that's completely the wrong way around. It's the most selfless thing you can do to bring somebody into the world who will keep our society going and pay tax and look after people in their old age.
But that's all to the benefit of us, the people that exist that are here already. I've got lots of texts coming in saying actually it is selfish to bring a child into this world, given the problems that we've got.
But you see, that's
the society we have.
that's complete misinformation, because there's never been a better time to be born. Poverty is lower than it's ever been globally, massively lower than it was when I was born. Yes, there are wars, but fewer than many other times in history. And, we are incredibly wealthy compared to what we were before. Life expectancy is over 80. Just 70 years ago, it was 65. It's an incredible time to be born. The kind of education, life expectancy, all those kind of things. But we're constantly fed this doom narrative about the world, about wars, about climate change that actually don't stack up. It's a fantastic time to be born. And actually, we need people to be born now more than ever. And some of these narratives that kind of started in the 60s and 70s about the world being overpopulated, they aren't true. I mean, a global population is going to peak in a couple of decades, and then it's going to fall very, very rapidly because so many countries now have below replacement fertility. So if you're worried about climate change, population decrease is going to become a big, big problem before climate change becomes a bigger problem. So this is the big economic problem facing our societies. Other countries are waking up to it. You've got countries like France, President Macron calling it a national emergency, bringing in even more strong family policies. France has quite strong family policies already, and other countries too. So we need to wake up. You need children in the society. Also, you need young people for economic growth. It's no surprise that we have productivity issues. We're stagnating because we have fewer and fewer innovative, creative young people coming into the workplace. You can't grow and be productive if you don't have young people.
That's very, very true. Miriam, two final questions for you. You said something a moment ago that I thought was really interesting. You said social media has put people off having children. What do you mean?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons for that. What's really interesting is that fertility across the Western world started declining from the 70s, but it took a real hit in the 2010s. And the one thing that all the countries have got in common is the introduction of the iPhone and then social media. I think there are several factors. Social media puts people off having real-life relationships. So we know that young people are having less sex, for example. Obviously, that's not a very good thing if you want to make babies. So,
it's rather important when it comes to having kids, yeah.
There are a lot more people are still virgins by the age of, late 20s, early 30s. There's something in digital relationships that it's easier to have relationships online than it is to kind of risk rejection and all those other kind of things in more normal relationships. I think social media makes people depressed and anxious. That's not good for forming relationships. The other interesting factor is the relationship between marriage and fertility. There's a close relationship between marriage rate and number of children. Most people, when they get married, they then have children. Whereas what often happens if people don't end up getting married is they either don't have children or they have one child and they split up. So marriage rates have totally collapsed over the last 15 years. So that's clearly had an impact too. Again, we don't know exactly why that is, but it's the same in America. It's the same in other countries in Europe. So there's so many different factors. But what's so interesting is that this is a global problem, especially in the West. And so when people say, oh, it's Tory austerity, etc., it just doesn't stack up. I'm not saying the last government was perfect. It wasn't. It did not do anything for families, and it could have done a lot more. So that is completely true. But it's not true that the Tory government is responsible for lack of birth rates, because the Tory government was not ruling the whole world, thank goodness.
Miriam, let me ask you just about that then, finally, because we've talked about the problem. I think we'd probably agree that the government shouldn't be forcing people to have children.
Absolutely,
It probably even shouldn't be telling people to have children, but perhaps it can do things that would at least make it easier for people to have children, lift the barriers that are stopping them in the first place. What might that look like? How can policy help solve this problem?
Yeah, so I think policy absolutely can help. I think it can help by making family life cheaper and easier and more attractive. And also, the policy itself can change the culture. So you think about policies that governments have brought in over the last few decades on smoking or on environmentalism. They have not only helped people make particular choices, but they also have changed the culture about what's acceptable and what's good. So I think government does have a role to play. So one thing that the government could absolutely do would be to help compensate people for the lack of income in the first 2 or 3 years of having a child, because obviously most families will have to give up an income for at least some of that time. So at the moment, there's just the only help you have is to put your child in an institution for 30 hours a week. That's not what most mothers particularly want. They want to care for their own children, and for good reason. That's usually what's best for the child. But our tax system and our benefit system could very easily be reformed to support people in those early years. Other countries do it. I mean, we are at such disadvantage. I think families in this country pay about 30% more tax than families in France and Germany, just because of the way our tax system is stacked against families. So that's something very easy that could be done. You could increase child benefit. It hasn't increased for a long, long time. It's a measly amount of money. We give people pensions regardless of whether or not they've paid enough in over their lives. In fact, most people haven't. Most old people get about £250,000 more out of the welfare state than they've put in. So why shouldn't families get a bit as well? So there's lots of things we could do to stack the help of the state in favour of families, which I think would help. But and it would also help change the culture, because it would send the message that actually this is a great thing to do for your community, for your country. Have a child and we'll help you raise it. I think is probably the best message to send. But there are no simple solutions, and countries that are throwing everything at this problem. I mean, Hungary spends 5% of their GDP on family policy, and they've seen a slight uptick in births and a reasonably big uptick in marriage, but not massive. So there isn't a silver bullet.
Okay. Miriam, really interesting stuff. Thank you very much indeed for coming on.